Chapter 16. And so the second week began, and all was harmony. The arrival of Mr. Wilkins, instead of, as 3 of the party had feared and the 4th had only been protected from fearing by her burning faith in the effect on him of San Salvatore, disturbing such harmony as there was, increased it. He fitted in. He was determined to please, and he did please. He was most amiable to his wife, not only in public, which he was used to, but in private, when he certainly wouldn't have been if he hadn't wanted to. He did want to. He was so much obliged to her, so much pleased with her, for making him acquainted with Lady Caroline, that he felt really fond of her. Also proud, for there must be, he reflected, a good deal more in her than he had supposed, for Lady Caroline to have become so intimate with her, and so affectionate. And the more he treated her as though she were really very nice, the more Lottie expanded and became really very nice, and the more he, affected in his turn, became really very nice himself. So that they went round and round, not in a vicious, but in a highly virtuous circle. Positively, for him, Mellersh petted her. There was at no time much pet in Mellersh, because he was by nature a cool man. Yet such was the influence on him of, as Lottie supposed, San Salvatore, that in this second week he sometimes pinched both her ears, one after the other, instead of only one. And Lottie, marvelling at such rapidly developing affectionateness, wondered what he would do, should he continue at this rate, in the third week, when her supply of ears would have come to an end. He was particularly nice about the washstand, and genuinely desirous of not taking up too much of the space in the small bedroom. Quick to respond, Lottie was even more desirous not to be in his way, and the room became the scene of many an affectionate combat de générosité, each of which left them more pleased with each other than ever. He did not again have a bath in the bathroom, though it was mended and ready for him, but got up and went down every morning to the sea, and in spite of the cool nights making the water cold, early had his dip, as a man should, and came up to breakfast rubbing his hands and feeling, as he told Mrs. Fisher, prepared for anything. Lottie's belief in the irresistible influence of the heavenly atmosphere of San Salvatore being thus obviously justified, and Mr. Wilkins, whom Rose knew as alarming and Scrap had pictured as icily unkind, being so evidently a changed man, both Rose and Scrap began to think there might after all be something in what Lottie insisted on, and that San Salvatore did work purgingly on the character. They were the more inclined to think so, and that they too felt a working going on inside themselves. They felt more cleared, both of them, that second week. Scrap, in her thoughts, many of which were now quite nice thoughts, real amiable ones about her parents and relations, with a glimmer in them of recognition of the extraordinary benefits she had received at the hands of, what? Fate? Providence? Anyhow, of something, and of how, having received them, she had misused them by failing to be happy. And Rose in her bosom, which though it still yearned to some purpose, for she was reaching the conclusion that merely inactively to yearn was no use at all, and that she must either by some means stop her yearning, or give it at least a chance, remote, but still a chance, of being quieted by writing to Frederick and asking him to come out. If Mr. Wilkins could be changed, thought Rose, why not Frederick? How wonderful it would be! How too wonderful if the place worked on him too, and were able to make them even a little understand each other, even a little, be friends. Rose, so far had loosening and disintegration gone on in her character, now was beginning to think her obstinate straight-lacedness about his books and her austere absorption in good works had been foolish and perhaps even wrong. He was her husband, and she had frightened him away. She had frightened love away. Precious love. And that couldn't be good. Was not Lottie right when she said the other day that nothing at all except love mattered? Nothing certainly seemed much use unless it was built up on love. But once frightened away, could it ever come back? Yes, it might in that beauty. It might in the atmosphere of happiness Lottie and San Salvatore seemed between them to spread round like some divine infection. She had, however, to get him there first, and he certainly couldn't be got there if she didn't write and tell him where she was. She would write. She must write. For if she did, there was at least a chance of his coming, and if she didn't, there was manifestly none. And then, once here in this loveliness, with everything so soft and kind and sweet all round, it would be easier to tell him, to try and explain, to ask for something different, for at least an attempt at something different in their lives, in the future, instead of the blankness of separation. The cold, oh, the cold of nothing at all but the great windiness of faith, the great bleakness of works. Why, one person in the world, one single person belonging to one, of one's very own, to talk to take care of, to love, to be interested in, was worth more than all the speeches on platforms and the compliments of chairmen in the world. It was also worth more. Rose couldn't help it. The thought would come, than all the prayers. These thoughts were not head thoughts, like Scraps, who was altogether free from yearnings, but bosom thoughts. They lodged in the bosom. It was in the bosom that Rose ached, and felt so dreadfully lonely. And when her courage failed her, as it did on most days, and it seemed impossible to write to Frederick, she would look at Mr. Wilkins and revive. There he was, a changed man. There he was, going into that small, uncomfortable room every night, that room whose proximities had been Lottie's only misgiving, and coming out of it in the morning, and Lottie coming out of it too, both of them as unclouded and as nice to each other as when they went in. And hadn't he, so critical at home, Lottie had told her, of the least thing going wrong, emerged from the Bath catastrophe as untouched in spirit as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were untouched in body when they emerged from the fire? Miracles were happening in this place. If they could happen to Mr. Wilkins, why not to Frederick? She got up quickly. Yes, she would write. She would go and write to him at once. But suppose... She paused. Suppose he didn't answer. Suppose he didn't even answer. And she sat down again to think a little longer. In these hesitations did Rose spend most of the second week. Then there was Mrs. Fisher. Her restlessness increased that second week. It increased to such an extent that she might just as well not have had her private sitting room at all, for she could no longer sit. Not for 10 minutes together could Mrs. Fisher sit. And added to the restlessness, as the days of the second week proceeded on their way, she had a curious sensation, which worried her, of rising sap. She knew the feeling because she had sometimes had it in childhood in specially swift springs, when the lilacs and the syringas seemed to rush out into blossom in a single night, but it was strange to have it again after over 50 years. She would have liked to remark on the sensation to someone, but she was ashamed. It was such an absurd sensation at her age. Yet oftener and oftener, and every day more and more, did Mrs. Fisher have a ridiculous feeling as if she were presently going to burgeon. Sternly she tried to frown the unseemly sensation down. Burgeon, indeed. She had heard of dried staffs, pieces of mere dead wood, suddenly putting forth fresh leaves, but only in legend. She was not in legend. She knew perfectly what was due to herself. Dignity demanded that she should have nothing to do with fresh leaves at her age. And yet, there it was. The feeling that presently, that at any moment now, she might crop out all green. Mrs. Fisher was upset. There were many things she disliked more than anything else, and one was when the elderly imagined they felt young and behaved accordingly. Of course, they only imagined it. They were only deceiving themselves. But how deplorable were the results? She herself had grown old as people should grow old, steadily and firmly. No interruptions, no belated afterglows and spasmodic returns. If, after all these years, she were now going to be deluded into some sort of unsuitable breaking out, how humiliating. Indeed, she was thankful that second week that Kate Lumley was not there. It would be most unpleasant, should anything different occur in her behaviour, to have Kate looking on. Kate had known her all her life. She felt she could let herself go. Here Mrs. Fisher frowned at the book she was vainly trying to concentrate on, for where did that expression come from? Much less painfully before strangers than before an old friend. Old friends, reflected Mrs. Fisher, who hoped she was reading, compare one constantly with what one used to be. They are always doing it if one develops. They are surprised at development. They hark back. They expect motionlessness after, say, 50, to the end of one's days. That, thought Mrs. Fisher, her eyes going steadily line by line down the page and not a word of it getting through into her consciousness, is foolish of friends. It is condemning one to a premature death. One should continue, of course with dignity, to develop, however old one may be. She had nothing against developing, against further ripeness, because as long as one was alive, one was not dead, obviously, decided Mrs. Fisher, and development, change, ripening, were life. What she would dislike would be unripening, going back to something green. She would dislike it intensely. And this is what she felt she was on the brink of doing. Naturally, it made her very uneasy, and only in constant movement could she find distraction. Increasingly restless and no longer able to confine herself to her battlements, she wandered more and more frequently, and also aimlessly, in and out of the top garden, to the growing surprise of Scrap, especially when she found that all Mrs. Fisher did was to stare for a few minutes at the view, pick a few dead leaves off the rose bushes, and go away again. In Mr. Wilkins's conversation she found temporary relief, but though he joined her whenever he could, he was not always there, for he spread his attentions judiciously among the three ladies, and when he was somewhere else, she had to face and manage her thoughts as best she could by herself. Perhaps it was the excess of light and colour at San Salvatore which made every other place seem dark and black. And Prince of Wales Terrace did seem a very dark black spot to have to go back to. A dark, narrow street, and her house dark and narrow as the street, with nothing really living or young in it. The goldfish could hardly be called living, or at most not more than half living, and were certainly not young, and except for them, there were only the maids, and they were dusty old things. Dusty old things? Mrs. Fisher paused in her thoughts, arrested by the strange expression. Where had it come from? How was it possible for it to come at all? It might have been one of Mrs. Wilkins's, in its levity, its almost slang. Perhaps it was one of hers, and she had heard her say it and unconsciously caught it from her. If so, this was both serious and disgusting. That the foolish creature should penetrate into Mrs. Fisher's very mind and establish her personality there, the personality which was still, in spite of the harmony apparently existing between her and her intelligent husband, so alien to Mrs. Fisher's own, so far removed from what she understood and liked, and infect her with her undesirable phrases, was most disturbing. Never in her life before had such a sentence come into Mrs. Fisher's head. Never in her life before had she thought of her maids, or anybody else, as dusty old things. Her maids were not dusty old things. They were most respectable, neat women, who were allowed the use of the bathroom every Saturday night. Elderly, certainly, but then so was she. So was her house. So was her furniture. So were her goldfish. They were all elderly, as they should be, together. But there was a great difference between being elderly and being a dusty old thing. How true it was what Ruskin said, that evil communications corrupt good manners. But did Ruskin say it? On second thought, she was not sure. But it was just the sort of thing he would have said if he had said it, and in any case it was true. Merely hearing Mrs. Wilkins's evil communications at meals, she did not listen. She avoided listening, yet it was evident she had heard. Those communications which, in that they so often were at once vulgar, indelicate, and profane, and always, she was sorry to say, laughed at by Lady Caroline, must be classed as evil, was spoiling her own mental manners. Soon she might not only think, but say. How terrible that would be. If that were the form her breaking out was going to take, the form of unseemly speech, Mrs. Fisher was afraid she would hardly with any degree of composure be able to bear it. At this stage, Mrs. Fisher wished more than ever that she were able to talk over her strange feelings with someone who would understand. There was, however, no one who would understand except Mrs. Wilkins herself. She would. She would know at once, Mrs. Fisher was sure, what she felt like. But this was impossible. It would be as abject as begging the very microbe that was infecting one for protection against its disease. She continued, accordingly, to bear her sensations in silence, and was driven by them into that frequent, aimless appearing in the top garden, which presently roused even Scrap's attention. Scrap had noticed it and vaguely wondered at it for some time before Mr. Wilkins inquired of her one morning as he arranged her cushions for her. He had established the daily assisting of Lady Caroline into her chair as his special privilege, whether there was anything the matter with Mrs. Fisher. At that moment, Mrs. Fisher was standing by the eastern parapet, shading her eyes and carefully scrutinizing the distant white houses of Mezzago. They could see her through the branches of the daphnes. "I don't know," said Scrap. "She's a lady, I take it," said Mr. Wilkins, "who would be unlikely to have anything on her mind." "I should imagine so," said Scrap, smiling. "If she has, and her restlessness appears to suggest it, I should be more than glad to assist her with advice." "I am sure you would be most kind." "Of course she has her own legal adviser, but he's not on the spot. I am. And a lawyer on the spot," said Mr. Wilkins, who endeavoured to make his conversation when he talked to Lady Caroline light, aware that one must be light with young ladies, "is worth two in— we won't be ordinary and complete the proverb, but say London." "You should ask her." "Ask her if she needs assistance? Would you advise it? Would it not be a little delicate to touch on such a question? The question whether or no a lady has something on her mind?" "Perhaps she will tell you if you go and talk to her. I think it must be lonely to be Mrs. Fisher." "You are all thoughtfulness and consideration," declared Mr. Wilkins, wishing for the first time in his life that he were a foreigner, so that he might respectfully kiss her hand on withdrawing to go obediently and relieve Mrs. Fisher's loneliness. It was wonderful what a variety of exits from her corner Scrap contrived for Mr. Wilkins. Each morning she found a different one, which sent him off pleased after he had arranged her cushions for her. She allowed him to arrange the cushions because she instantly had discovered, the very first 5 minutes of the very first evening, that her fears lest he should cling to her and stare in dreadful admiration were baseless. Mr. Wilkins did not admire like that. It was not only, she instinctively felt, not in him, but if it had been, he would not have dared to in her case. He was all respectfulness. She could direct his movements in regard to herself with the raising of an eyelash. His one concern was to obey. She had been prepared to like him if he would only be so obliging as not to admire her, and she did like him. She did not forget his moving defencelessness the first morning in his towel, and he amused her, and he was kind to Lottie. It is true she liked him most when he wasn't there, but then she usually liked everybody most when they weren't there. Certainly, he did seem to be one of those men, rare in her experience, who never looked at a woman from the predatory angle. The comfort of this, the simplification it brought into the relations of the party, was immense. From this point of view, Mr. Wilkins was simply ideal. He was unique and precious. Whenever she thought of him, and was perhaps inclined to dwell on the aspects of him that were a little boring, she remembered this, and murmured, "But what a treasure!" Indeed, it was Mr. Wilkins's one aim during his stay at San Salvatore to be a treasure. At all costs, the 3 ladies who were not his wife must like him and trust him. Then presently, when trouble arose in their lives, and in what lives did not trouble sooner or later arise, they would recollect how reliable he was and how sympathetic, and turn to him for advice. Ladies with something on their minds were exactly what he wanted. Lady Caroline, he judged, had nothing on hers at the moment, but so much beauty, for he could not but see what was evident, must have had its difficulties in the past and would have more of them before it had done. In the past, he had not been at hand. In the future, he hoped to be. And meanwhile, the behaviour of Mrs. Fisher, the next in importance of the ladies from the professional point of view, showed definite promise. It was almost certain that Mrs. Fisher had something on her mind. He'd been observing her attentively, and it was almost certain. With the third, with Mrs. Arbuthnot, he had up to this made least headway, for she was so very retiring and quiet. But might not this very retiringness, this tendency to avoid the others and spend her time alone, indicate that she too was troubled? If so, he was her man. He would cultivate her. He would follow her and sit with her and encourage her to tell him about herself. Arbuthnot, he understood from Lottie, was a British Museum official. Nothing specially important at present, but Mr. Wilkins regarded it as his business to know all sorts and kinds. Besides, there was promotion. Arbuthnot promoted might become very much worthwhile. As for Lottie, she was charming. She really had all the qualities he had credited her with during his courtship, and they had been, it appeared, merely in abeyance since. His early impressions of her were now being endorsed by the affection and even admiration Lady Caroline showed for her. Lady Caroline Dester was the last person, he was sure, to be mistaken on such a subject. Her knowledge of the world, her constant association with only the best, must make her quite unerring. Lottie was, evidently then, that which before marriage he had believed her to be. She was valuable. She certainly had been most valuable in introducing him to Lady Caroline and Mrs. Fisher. A man in his profession could be immensely helped by a clever and attractive wife. Why had she not been attractive sooner? Why this sudden flowering? Mr. Wilkins began too to believe there was something peculiar, as Lottie had almost at once informed him, in the atmosphere of San Salvatore. It promoted expansion. It brought out dormant qualities. And feeling more and more pleased, and even charmed by his wife, and very content with the progress he was making with the two others, and hopefully of progress to be made with the retiring third, Mr. Wilkins could not remember ever having had such an agreeable holiday. The only thing that might perhaps be bettered was the way they would call him Mr. Wilkins. Nobody said Mr. Mellersh Wilkins, yet he had introduced himself to Lady Caroline. He flinched a little on remembering the circumstances, as Mellersh Wilkins. Still, this was a small matter, not enough to worry about. He would be foolish if in such a place and such society he worried about anything. He was not even worrying about what the holiday was costing, and had made up his mind to pay not only his own expenses, but his wife's as well, and surprise her at the end by presenting her with her nest egg as intact as when she started. And just the knowledge that he was preparing a happy surprise for her made him feel warmer than ever towards her. In fact, Mr. Wilkins, who had begun by being consciously and according to plan on his best behaviour, remained on it unconsciously and with no effort at all. And meanwhile, the beautiful golden days were dropping gently from the second week one by one, equal in beauty with those of the first. And the scent of bean fields in flower on the hillside behind the village came across to San Salvatore whenever the air moved. In the garden that second week, the poet's-eyed narcissus disappeared out the long grass at the edge of the zigzag path, and wild gladiolus, slender and rose-coloured, came in their stead. White pinks bloomed in the borders, filling the whole place with their smoky sweet smell, and a bush nobody had noticed burst into glory and fragrance and it was a purple lilac bush. Such a jumble of spring and summer was not to be believed in, except by those who dwelt in those gardens. Everything seemed to be out together. All the things crowded into 1 month, which in England are spread penuriously over 6. Even primroses were found one day by Mrs. Wilkins in a cold corner up in the hills, and when she brought them down to the geraniums and heliotrope of San Salvatore, they looked quite shy. Chapter 17. On the first day of the 3rd week, Rose wrote to Frederick. In case she should again hesitate and not post the letter, she gave it to Domenico to post, for if she did not write now, there would be no time left at all. Half the month at San Salvatore was over. Even if Frederick started directly he got the letter, which of course he wouldn't be able to do, what with packing and passport, besides not being in a hurry to come, he couldn't arrive for 5 days. Having done it, Rose wished she hadn't. He wouldn't come. He wouldn't bother to answer. And if he did answer, it would just be giving some reason which was not true, about being too busy to get away. And all that had been got by writing to him would be that she would be more unhappy than before. What things one did when one was idle! This resurrection of Frederick, or rather this attempt to resurrect him, what was it but the result of having nothing whatever to do? She wished she had never come away on a holiday. What did she want with holidays? Work was her salvation. Work was the only thing that protected one, that kept one steady and one's values true. At home in Hampstead, absorbed and busy, she'd managed to get over Frederick, thinking of him latterly only with the gentle melancholy with which one thinks of someone once loved but long since dead. And now, this place, idleness in this soft place, had thrown her back to the wretched state she had climbed so carefully out of years ago. Why, if Frederick did come, she would only bore him. Hadn't she seen in a flash quite soon after getting to San Salvatore that that was really what kept him away from her? And why should she suppose that now, after such a long estrangement, she would be able not to bore him, be able to do anything but stand before him like a tongue-tied idiot with all the fingers of her spirit turned into thumbs? Besides, what a hopeless position, to have, as it were, to beseech. Please wait a little. Please don't be impatient. I think perhaps I shan't be a bore presently. 1,000 times a day, Rose wished she had let Frederick alone. Lottie, who asked her every evening whether she had sent her letter yet, exclaimed with delight when the answer at last was yes, and threw her arms round her. "Now we shall be completely happy," cried the enthusiastic Lottie. But nothing seemed less certain to Rose, and her expression became more and more the expression of one who has something on her mind. Mr. Wilkins, wanting to find out what it was, strolled in the sun in his Panama hat and began to meet her accidentally. "I did not know," said Mr. Wilkins the first time, courteously raising his hat, "that you too liked this particular spot." And he sat down beside her. In the afternoon she chose another spot, and she had not been in it half an hour before Mr. Wilkins, lightly swinging his cane, came round the corner. "We are destined to meet in our rambles," said Mr. Wilkins pleasantly. and he sat down beside her. Mr. Wilkins was very kind, and she saw, misjudged him in Hampstead, and this was the real man, ripened like fruit by the beneficent sun of San Salvatore. But Rose did want to be alone. Still, she was grateful to him for proving to her that though she might bore Frederick, she did not bore everybody. For if she had, he would not have sat talking to her on each occasion till it was time to go in. True, he bored her, but that wasn't anything like so dreadful as if she bored him. Then indeed her vanity would have been sadly ruffled. For now that Rose was not able to say her prayers, she was being assailed by every sort of weakness. Vanity, sensitiveness, irritability, pugnacity. Strange, unfamiliar devils to have coming crowding on one and taking possession of one's swept and empty heart. She had never been vain or irritable or pugnacious in her life before. Could it be that San Salvatore was capable of opposite effects, and the same sun that ripened Mr. Wilkins made her go acid? The next morning, so as to be sure of being alone, she went down, while Mr. Wilkins was still lingering pleasantly with Mrs. Fisher over breakfast, to the rocks by the water's edge where she and Lottie had sat the first day. Frederick, by now, had got her letter. Today, if he were like Mr. Wilkins, she might get a telegram from him. She tried to silence the absurd hope by jeering at it. Yet, if Mr. Wilkins had telegraphed, why not Frederick? The spell of San Salvatore lurked even, it seemed, in notepaper. Lottie had not dreamed of getting a telegram, and when she came in at lunchtime, there it was. It would be too wonderful if when she went back at lunchtime, she found one there for her too. Rose clasped her hands tight round her knees. How passionately she longed to be important to somebody again. Not important on platforms, not important as an asset in an organisation, but privately important, just to one other person. Quite privately. Nobody else to know or notice. It didn't seem much to ask in a world so crowded with people, just to have one of them, only one out of all the millions, to oneself. Somebody who needed one, who thought of one, who was eager to come to one. Oh, how dreadfully one wanted to be precious. All the morning she sat beneath the pine tree by the sea. Nobody came near her. The great hours passed slowly. They seemed enormous. But she wouldn't go up before lunch. She would give the telegram time to arrive. That day, Scrap, egged on by Lottie's persuasions, and also thinking that perhaps she had sat long enough, had arisen from her chair and cushions, and gone off with Lottie and sandwiches up into the hills till evening. Mr. Wilkins, who wished to go with them, stayed on Lady Caroline's advice with Mrs. Fisher, in order to cheer her solitude, and though he left off cheering her about 11 to go and look for Mrs. Arbuthnot, so as for a space to cheer her too, thus dividing himself impartially between these solitary ladies, he came back again presently, mopping his forehead, and continued with Mrs. Fisher where he had left off. For this time, Mrs. Arbuthnot had hidden successfully. There was a telegram, too, for her, he noticed when he came in. Pity he did not know where she was. "Ought we to open it?" he said to Mrs. Fisher. "No," said Mrs. Fisher. It may require an answer. I don't approve of tampering with other people's correspondence." "Tampering? My dear lady." Mr. Wilkins was shocked. Such a word. Tampering? He had the greatest possible esteem for Mrs. Fisher, but he did at times find her a little difficult. She liked him, he was sure, and she was in a fair way, he felt, to become a client. But he feared she would be a headstrong and secretive client. She was certainly secretive, for though he had been skilful and sympathetic for a whole week, she had as yet given him no inkling of what was so evidently worrying her. "Poor old thing," said Lottie, on his asking her if she perhaps could throw light on Mrs. Fisher's troubles. "She hasn't got love." "Love?" Mr. Wilkins could only echo, genuinely scandalized. "But surely, my dear, at her age—" "Any love," said Lottie. That very morning he had asked his wife, for he now sought and respected her opinion, if she could tell him what was the matter with Mrs. Arbuthnot, for she too, though he had done his best to thaw her into confidences, had remained persistently retiring. "She wants her husband," said Lottie. "Ah," said Mr. Wilkins, a new light shed on Mrs. Arbuthnot's shy and modest melancholy. And he added, "Very proper." And Lottie said, smiling at him, "One does." And Mr. Wilkins said, smiling at her, "Does one?" And Lottie said, smiling at him, "Of course." And Mr. Wilkins, much pleased with her, though it was still quite early in the day, a time when caresses are sluggish, pinched her ear. Just before 12:30, Rose came slowly up through the pergola and between the camellias ranged on either side of the old stone steps. The rivulets of periwinkles that flowed down them when first she arrived were gone, and now there were these bushes, incredibly rosetted. Pink, white, red, striped. She fingered and smelt them one after the other, so as not to get to her disappointment too quickly. As long as she hadn't seen for herself, seen the table in the hall quite empty except for its bowl of flowers, she still could hope. She could still have the joy of imagining the telegram lying on it, waiting for her. But there is no smell in a camellia, as Mr. Wilkins, who was standing in the doorway on the lookout for her and knew what was necessary in horticulture, reminded her. She started at his voice and looked up. "A telegram has come for you," said Mr. Wilkins. She stared at him, her mouth open. "I searched for you everywhere, but failed." Of course. She knew it. She'd been sure of it all the time. Bright and burning, youth in that instant flashed down again on Rose. She flew up the steps, red as the camellia she had just been fingering, and was in the hall and tearing open the telegram before Mr. Wilkins had finished his sentence. Why, but if things could happen like this, why, but there was no end to... Why, she and Frederick... They were going to be... again. At last. "No bad news, I trust?" said Mr. Wilkins, who had followed her. For when she had read the telegram, she stood staring at it, and her face went slowly white. Curious to watch how her face went slowly white. She turned and looked at Mr. Wilkins as if trying to remember him. "Oh no. On the contrary." She managed to smile. "I'm going to have a visitor," she said, holding out the telegram. And when he had taken it, she walked away towards the dining room, murmuring something about lunch being ready. Mr. Wilkins read the telegram. It had been sent that morning from Mezzago, and was, "Am passing through on way to Rome. May I pay my respects this afternoon? Thomas Briggs." Why should such a telegram make the interesting lady turn pale? For her pallor on reading it had been so striking as to convince Mr. Wilkins she was receiving a blow. "Who is Thomas Briggs?" he asked, following her into the dining room. She looked at him vaguely. "Who is—" she repeated, getting her thoughts together again. "Thomas Briggs? Oh, yes. He is the owner. This is his house. He is very nice. He is coming this afternoon." Thomas Briggs was at that very moment coming. He was jogging along the road between Mezzago and Castagneto in a fly, sincerely hoping that the dark-eyed lady would grasp that all he wanted was to see her, and not at all to see if his house were still there. He felt that an owner of delicacy did not intrude on a tenant, but he had been thinking so much of her since that day. Rose Arbuthnot. Such a pretty name, and such a pretty creature. Mild, milky, mothery, in the best sense. The best sense being that she wasn't his mother, and couldn't have been if she had tried, for parents were the only things impossible to have younger than oneself. Also, he was passing so near, it seemed absurd not just to look in, and see if she were comfortable. He longed to see her in his house. He longed to see it as her background. To see her sitting in his chairs, drinking out of his cups, using all his things. Did she put the big crimson cushion in the drawing-room behind her little dark head? Her hair and the whiteness of her skin would look lovely against it. Had she seen the portrait of herself on the stairs? He wondered if she liked it. He would explain it to her. If she didn't paint, and she had said nothing to suggest it, she wouldn't perhaps notice how exactly the moulding of the eyebrows and the slight hollow of the cheek. He told the fly to wait in Castagneto and crossed the piazza, hailed by children and dogs who all knew him and sprang up suddenly from nowhere, and walking quickly up the zigzag path, for he was an active young man, not much more than 30, he pulled the ancient chain that rang the bell, and waited decorously on the proper side of the open door to be allowed to come in. At the sight of him, Francesca flung up every bit of her that would fling up, eyebrows, eyelids, and hands, and volubly assured him that all was in perfect order and that she was doing her duty. Of course," said Briggs, cutting her short. "No one doubts it." And he asked her to take in his card to her mistress. "Which mistress?" asked Francesca. "Which mistress?" "There are 4, said Francesca, scenting an irregularity on the part of the tenants, for her master looked surprised. And she felt pleased, for life was dull, and irregularities helped it along at least a little. 4, he repeated, surprised. "Well, take it to the lot, then," he said, recovering himself, for he noticed her expression. Coffee was being drunk in the top garden in the shade of the umbrella pine. Only Mrs. Fisher and Mr. Wilkins were drinking it, for Mrs. Arbuthnot, after eating nothing and being completely silent during lunch, had disappeared immediately afterwards. While Francesca went away into the garden with his card, her master stood examining the picture on the staircase of that Madonna by an early Italian painter, name unknown, picked up by him at Orvieto, who was so much like his tenant. It really was remarkable, the likeness. Of course, his tenant that day in London had had her hat on, but he was pretty sure her hair grew just like that off her forehead. The expression of the eyes, grave and sweet, was exactly the same. He rejoiced to think that he would always have her portrait. He looked up at the sound of footsteps. And there she was, coming down the stairs just as he had imagined her in that place, dressed in white. She was astonished to see him so soon. She had supposed he would come about tea time. Until then she had meant to sit somewhere out of doors, where she could be by herself. He watched her coming down the stairs with the utmost eager interest. In a moment she would be level with her portrait. "It really is extraordinary," said Briggs. "How do you do?" said Rose, intent only on a decent show of welcome. She did not welcome him. He was here, she felt, the telegram bitter in her heart, instead of Frederick, doing what she had longed Frederick would do, taking his place. "Just stand still a moment." She obeyed automatically. "Yes, quite astonishing. Do you mind taking off your hat?" Rose, surprised, took it off obediently. "Yes, I thought so. I just wanted to make sure. And look, have you noticed?" He began to make odd, swift passes with his hand over the face in the picture, measuring it, looking from it to her. Rose's surprise became amusement, and she could not help smiling. "Have you come to compare me with my original?" she asked. "You do see how extraordinarily alike." "I didn't know I looked so solemn." "You don't. Not now. You did a minute ago. Quite as solemn. Oh, yes. How do you do?" he finished suddenly, noticing her outstretched hand. And he laughed and shook it, flushing, a trick of his, to the roots of his fair hair. Francesca came back. "The Signora Fisher," she said, "will be pleased to see him." "Who is the Signora Fisher?" he asked Rose. "One of the 4 who are sharing your house." "Then there are 4 of you?" "Yes. My friend and I found we couldn't afford it by ourselves." "Oh, I say," began Briggs in confusion, for he would best have liked Rose Arbuthnot, pretty name, not to have to afford anything, but to stay at San Salvatore as long as she liked as his guest. "Mrs. Fisher is having coffee in the top garden," said Rose. "I'll take you to her and introduce you." "I don't want to go. You've got your hat on, so you were going for a walk. Mayn't I come too? I'd immensely like being shown round by you." "But Mrs. Fisher is waiting for you." "Won't she keep?" "Yes," said Rose, with the smile that had so much attracted him the first day. "I think she will keep quite well till tea." "Do you speak Italian?" "No," said Rose. "Why?" On that he turned to Francesca and told her at a great rate, for in Italian he was glib, to go back to the Signora in the top garden and tell her he had encountered his old friend, the Signora Arbuthnot, and was going for a walk with her and would present himself to her later. "Do you invite me to tea?" he asked Rose, when Francesca had gone. "Of course. It's your house." "It isn't. It's yours." till Monday week," she smiled. "Come and show me all the views," he said eagerly. And it was plain, even to the self-depreciatory Rose, that she did not bore Mr. Brink.